I'm a teacher in Minnesota. I'm doing this very low tech. I'm just wanting to point out a few things that I see, consequently do something like an apologia for Christianity. So, that leads me to my next point. When we tell stories of greater and greater importance, we are always relating to ourselves and to other people the experiences we go through as human beings. Some experiences we can relate to children. Some experiences we can relate to adults. The experiences of the childhood are never abolished or destroyed completely. They're subsumed into the adult world. The things we learn as a child we take on to the adult world. However, when we transition to the adult world, some things we stop seeing as valid stories for that age. Rather, we have to have the stories transferred or altered or changed. As I tell my students, the gods of the nursery cannot be the gods of adulthood. The way we think about things as a child has to convert, has to change. And so we take on new stories as we grow older. The story of Red Riding Hood is very good for a child. As an adult, we carry that kernel, or as the ancient world called it, the kernel or germ of reality that the story conveys. But we take on a new story. We look at stories like Medea, for instance, for a story about what happens when you engage in bad relationships. Or we look at the story of Agamemnon being killed by his wife. But we don't tell one another the story of Red Riding Hood anymore. Now, this then shows that throughout our lives as humans, we are constantly telling and relating the stories. We can't help it. As I said elsewhere, humans lacking a story make up stories of their own. No human goes through life without a story of some kind. Every human being has an innate desire to know their own story and to tell their story to other people, to give their barbaric yelp to the world, and to say, here am I, here's my experience, is my experience bizarre? Well, the way we do that, of course, is by these stories. And when we don't have a bulk of story, what Yeats calls a phantasmagoria, then we create stories. We make up our own myth, our own continuous narrative. And the narrative that we have without a myth that's traditional is normally a narrative that is kind of a patchwork. It's pieced together. Nor do we necessarily know what that myth means. As a student of myth, then, we have to ask, well, what is this myth saying? What is that myth saying? And is this myth more powerful than this myth? If, for instance, we had an entire group of people who lived by the myth of Red Riding Hood, they'd probably still be very pedantic, very stunted in their thought process and their mythology and their thinking about life. If, on the other hand, an entire group was raised with a sense of the greatness of their civilization, for instance, the white man's burden, if you will, and the necessity of spreading culture, that would be a much more powerful story for them to hold on to. If a generation was raised with the thought that everything can be bought and life is cheap and all you can do is get your kicks and your violent addiction fulfilled before you yourself kick the bucket, that's a type of myth. It's a type of story. It's the type of narrative to which they can latch on. But it's a very bad one. When we are young, we think like children, and when we are adults, we put away the things of childhood and think like adults. I was very struck looking the other day at the cult of Artemis in the ancient world. In the cult of Artemis, young girls who themselves were devoted to the virgin goddess Artemis for most of their lives, when they would become women, when they were going to get married, they would go to the temple of Artemis and they'd lay on the altar the dolls and the clothing they'd worn as little girls, and that those things would be burned by the priestesses of Artemis. Why? Because when they get married, they can never go back to being children. They move out of the nursery. Marriage changes them from a virgin maiden to a woman, a mother, a bearer of life. And that change is represented by them leaving the things behind on the altar that previously had been the world of their childhood. That's my point. That as adults, we have to have a myth of some kind. And the myth that we have has to be appropriate to the age level at which we are. And the myth, without a formal form of myth, we will construct a myth, and it will probably be pretty shoddy at that. And so we have to ask ourselves, which is the myth that we are going to will ourselves to ascribe to? Which is the myth that embodies the thing we see the world as being? Which myth is greatest, if you want to look at it at a dividends and debits level? Which myth provides the greatest possibility for happiness and makes the most sense of our pain? There are several authors who consider this question, and I wanted to look just at a few of these authors at what they are saying about the mythological world.